When you look at what Syria is going through now, it is a very typical post-war situation. I know we still have the situation in Idlib and we still have a resolution to be achieved in the northeast, but effectively they have victory over 85% of their territory. What we're seeing, of course, is the economic war now. The use of sanctions, the use of, or the withholding of finance for reconstruction. So we're seeing financial blackmail by the states that have tried to destabilize Syria for the last 8 years. My work in Syria has been based around exposing the propaganda construct, as John Pilger, one of my heroes as a journalist and as a human being, describes the White Helmets, a propaganda construct affiliated to Nusra Front, predominantly Al-Qaeda in Syria, but also working with a number of the other extremist, sectarian, brutal terrorist factions inside Syria, all of which, of course, work very much under the umbrella of Nusra Front. Nusra Front is the dominant power among the terrorist groups inside Syria. So what I want to do today is maybe take it off into a slightly different direction and to demonstrate the oligarchy that works behind the scenes to actually produce, promote, whitewash, and basically support these NGOs, these organizations that work on the ground to both infiltrate target nation cultures, societies, to act in a way that supports intervention, military intervention, under a humanitarian pretext. So the White Helmets, for me, are an instrument. They are part of the hybrid war strategy, and they are very important in the sense that they influence decisions in the West. They provide the media with the propaganda they need to manufacture the consent for further military escalation or economic warfare against a country through economic terrorism, as I call it, through sanctions, which generally are illegitimate and illegal, an illegal way of collectively punishing the people of a country for the perceived state criminal actions, and I say perceived very strongly there. So basically what I'm going to take you on a journey through today is through the billionaire complex that is actually driving regime change, not only in Syria. This also sort of extrapolates out across other nations also, as we're now seeing it ramping up against Venezuela. What I'm going to go through is some of the information on the White Helmets that may not be quite as readily available as some other information. This was actually a government document. It was a draft document, so it wasn't, as far as I'm aware, made publicly available. But it actually details some of the financing to the, as they call them, the Syria Civil Defense, to the White Helmets. They are not the Syria Civil Defense. There is an existing Syria Civil Defense that was created inside Syria in 1953 that has actually effectively been targeted by the White Helmet organization and its affiliates in the extremist groups. But what this does, I'm not going to linger on the actual financing. This is only a small amount of the financing that comes through the Conflict Stability and Security Fund, that is a means by which the British government is funding its development abroad. Development loosely translated into its war machine, into its intervention policies abroad, and in this case, in Syria. But what is very interesting is part of this document details the fact that organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International are largely reliant upon the White Helmets for evidence for their reports. So immediately what this does is to set the scene that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, which are proven to be to have a revolving door policy with US state administration and deep state in the United States, are reliant upon the White Helmet evidence from on the ground, which corroborates the foreign policy both in the UK and in the US, to actually fabricate their reports that again further the war effort against Syria. I'm going to have to skip slightly through some of the slides because otherwise I think Kari's going to be shouting at me because I'm going to be well over time. But basically, As I've mentioned, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have a known record of being an instrument for US foreign policy, and US foreign policy is effectively intervention, resource plundering, the implementation of governments that are friendly to US policy and who are not going to stand against US policy in their country. Now, Patrick did an absolutely brilliant presentation in which he talked about the Integrity Initiative, but the reason that I'm just going to quickly bring this in is to show to what extent the White Helmets as an organization, or rather, in my view, as a global franchise, as a concept, is being integrated into the disinformation cluster, which Patrick brilliantly described. The White Helmets are actually mentioned in one of the Integrity Initiative documents as being educators for the future on how to actually produce the disinformation. That's not obviously what they're saying in the document, that's my translation of the document. To produce the disinformation that will manufacture consent for British government policies, and as we know, NATO policies. And actually, in this part, we actually see the White Helmets. And of course, the political war, this was part of that Integrity Initiative document, the political war on chemical weapon use in Syria. But in fact, what we know, and what I know in particular, having investigated the White Helmet narratives, particularly in Eastern Ghouta, is that in fact, what the White Helmets, one of their major roles was to produce the chemical weapon attack stories to serve the political purpose of the governments who finance them. Now, this is actually the article. It was an exclusive that I wrote for 21st Century Wire. But last year, I was able to actually, partly by mistake, actually enter a functioning White Helmet Center in Dara al-Balad in July 2018. As Ava mentioned, she'd actually been in Dara in May 2018 when it was effectively still under the control of the armed groups, including an al-Qaeda affiliate or a rebrand. So at this point, this was in July 2018, and Dara itself had accepted, in most of the areas, it had accepted a Russian brokered reconciliation deal. But in this area of Dara al-Balad, it was still under control of the armed groups. And at this point, they hadn't accepted the full agreement, the full reconciliation agreement. So effectively, this area was ostensibly under the control of the Russian military and the Russian reconciliation team, but it was still being locally controlled by the armed groups, who had given up their heavy weapons, but not their light weapons. So we actually entered, and what you can actually see is here, and this is standard for all of the White Helmet centers. Every single White Helmet center that I have visited across all of the liberated areas of Syria, where they functioned alongside the terrorist groups, you will find them predominantly in a complex that was controlled and dominated by Nusra Front, often in school complexes. This was a school. So we fundamentally entered here, the Nusra Front Center was here, and the White Helmet Center was in the grounds of the Nusra Front Center. And as I say, this was still functioning, as we found out when we entered the center and were met with White Helmet operatives. What is very interesting here is all of the equipment came from the UK, including the fire engine that you'll see at the end of this very short clip. It had UK registration plates still on it. The reason that I managed to speak to these White Helmets was that I didn't give my name. I told them I was a British journalist, and actually they saw it as an opportunity to try and regain funding that they told me they had lost about 6 weeks previously. Now, I mentioned the fact that White Helmet centers, I'll come back to what was actually said to me by the White Helmets in Dada very quickly. But what I also want to point out, this is Madik Citadel. It's an area in northern Hama. Ava spoke to you about the raining down of cluster munitions on Mahade. But one day after that attack, which took the lives of 13 civilians, including the children, as you heard, a neighboring town, a Syrian Christian town of Al-Skelbiyeh, also came under attack by the same cluster munitions from Madik Citadel. And the building that is circled there is a White Helmet center. So the White Helmets were actually in a town that has been taken over by Jaish al-Islam and Nusra Front, who were evacuated from eastern Ghouta after its liberation. And the White Helmet Center is the biggest building in that area which is controlled by terrorists and which, the day before I took this photograph, had targeted a Syrian Christian town, targeted civilian areas, markets, houses, residential areas, schools, etc., with cluster munitions. Now, coming back to Dada and to the White Helmet Center, I've deliberately tried to pixelate out this image because one of the stories of white helmets being involved in the execution and mutilation of civilians and Syrian Arab army prisoners of war, one of the stories that haunted me the most was this one, which was in June 2017. And it was to the south of Dara city. It was at an airbase that was being held by Syrian Arab army soldiers. It was taken over by a number of militant factions. The Syrian Arab army soldiers were either massacred during the battles, or they were brought back to Dara, where their bodies were actually dismembered by the armed groups, and they were helped by the White Helmets, and they were actually videoed doing this. Again, I've tried to take out the really gory details, but this is a White Helmet operative on your left, clambering over the dead bodies of Syrian Arab army soldiers. At one point, one of the extremists holds up one of the Syrian Arab army soldiers' heads, and the White Helmet member is seen enjoying that fact, that making a trophy of a head of a Syrian Arab army soldier. I know also, Eva, I think when you were in Dara, I cited you in my article on this. I think you were also told by civilians that the White Helmets would dismember the bodies of soldiers, put them in plastic bags, and then take them to the dump. In speaking to the leader of the White Helmets in Dada, when I asked him a number of questions, and I asked him, this was just after the evacuation by Israel of the White Helmet operatives from the south in Quneitra, I also went to follow their route through Quneitra and through the fence that ring fences the illegally annexed territory, Syrian territory, by Israel. And it was through that gate and through that fence that the White Helmets passed, but not only the White Helmets, a number of militant group leaders, including Nusra Front and ISIS. Now, when I spoke to Abu Mohammed al-Mahamid, who was the leader of this sector of White Helmets, I asked him, were there any members of Nusra Front within his group? Now, of course, he's not going to admit to that to me. He wants to increase his funding. He wants me to give him a good report when I go back to the British government, in his view. But what he did say to me was, no, we're great. We're absolutely clean. We only rescue civilians. We never do anything to harm the soldiers. Actually, we rescue the soldiers as well. Now, bear in mind There is video evidence of the white helmets from this center dismembering the bodies of Syrian Arab army prisoners of war. We know Abu Mohanad al-Mahamiz was also filmed supporting the armed groups in Ghouta, calling for them to take up arms against the Syrian Arab army, etc. So we know that he has affiliations to the armed groups. But his, if you like, his narrative that he gave to me was that this group in Dara were clean. But the majority of the white helmet groups across Syria, of course they were Nusra Front. And a very important point that he made to me, unwittingly, was that he said, basically, if the leader of a white helmet group is Nusra Front, if a leader is Al-Qaeda, then the rest of the group must be Al-Qaeda. They will have to follow in the ideology of the leader of that group. Why is this important? It's important because the guy in the middle, Abdulaziz Maghrabi, was the leader of the White Helmet Group in East Aleppo. But he was not only the leader of the White Helmet Group in East Aleppo, he was originally with Al-Tawid Brigade when they invaded Aleppo in 2012. He then became a leader of Nusra Front. But here he is actually pictured with Abu Amara. Now, Abu Amara were a group who basically ran the protection racket for Nusra Front, and who had a reputation for being even more brutal towards civilians than Nusra Front. There are also a number of pictures with him, with al-Sham, with Al-Qaeda, etc. But what is also interesting is Abdulaziz Maghrabi was not only the leader of the White Helmets in East Aleppo, he was also elected president of the local council in East Aleppo in 2013. A local council which is funded by an initiative set up by the British government and funded by the Conflict Stability and Security Fund. So not only is the British government funding the White Helmets, they are funding terrorism in East Aleppo under the banner of humanitarianism, under the banner of civil society and democracy. All of this is covered in my article at 21st Century Wire. Then, of course, just to give you a little bit more proof of the White Helmets' affiliation to Al-Qaeda. This is Abu Jabba, the leader. He was actually the emir of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is a rebrand of Al-Qaeda, which is effectively now in control of Idlib. And you will have heard that HTS is absorbing many of the lesser armed groups into its gang, basically. This is gang warfare that we're now seeing in Idlib. But here we have Abu Jabba basically praising the White Helmets.
رسالة شكر وعرفان لجنود ثورتنا الأخفياء وعلى رأسهم آباء وأمهات الشهداء ورجال القبعات البيضاء.
It's also worth noting that Abdullah Muhaizini, a Riyadh-trained, funded sheikh who's also he's on the US terrorist list, has also described the White Helmets as the soldiers of the revolution. Now, I'm going to come on to this series of articles that I wrote with the amazing Whitney Webb at Mint Press News. I urge everybody to follow her reports. She's one of the best journalists at the moment covering world events at Mint Press News. The Joe Cox 4. Now, I don't know what you all know about the Joe Cox murder in June 2016. But Jo Cox was a prominent Labour MP. She was murdered in June 2016. But what I'm going to focus on today is how her death has been instrumentalized to allow the oligarchy to further promote the White Helmet construct, to raise money for the White Helmet construct. And when I'm talking about the White Helmet construct, it's not just the White Helmets. It's what the White Helmets represent. They represent the ability to go to war for the nations who are funding them. And they represent, and this is very important, and I'm going to cover that in this talk, they represent the harvesting from war. What is the harvesting from war? Many of you may think it's resources, it's oil. But in my opinion, one of the most terrible, heinous harvests from war is that of organs. It's that of children. It's that of human beings. So we have the Joe Cox Fund, which was set up within 24 hours of Joe Cox's murder. So despite this being a shocking event that could not have been foreseen, within 24 hours, the public relations machine that is manufacturing consent for war in Syria and is promoting and supporting the White Helmets went into action with the Joe Cox Fund. I'd like to give you a quote from Professor Piers Robinson, who heads up an academic working group investigating, in particular, the propaganda against Syria and focusing largely on the chemical attacks. Piers says, understanding the way in which power is exercised in democracies requires careful and detailed exploration of power networks. In the contemporary world, these involve relationships between state actors, political movements, think tanks in particular, business interests, and also popular culture and celebrity politics. Part of modern-day propaganda operations aimed at the mobilization of bias involve power political and economic actors co-opting media and popular culture celebrities in order to promote particular worldviews, shape public understanding, and to achieve concrete political outcomes. As I said, this is a series of articles focusing on the billionaire network, trying to put into effect regime change in Syria with the White Helmets as their primary tool. Interesting question. Joe Cox has been largely sanctified since her murder. A terrible murder, I condemn the murder. But we need to remain objective. Who was Joe Cox and what did she advocate for? She was a tireless advocate for Syrian moderate opposition. She was a supporter of the UK Foreign Office financed and created propaganda construct, the White Helmets. She was a member of the Fabian Society, which actively furthers the globalist policies of the UK government. She upheld the myth that the Syrian government had created ISIS. She claimed that Syria was not another Iraq, so she fundamentally tried to erase the historical context of the Syrian conflict. She was a fierce advocate for refugees while not addressing the cause of the exodus from Syria, which was a UK policy of intervention in Syria and the financing of the terrorist groups who were displacing Syrian people from their homes, the majority of whom, by the way, within Syria, fled to Syrian government-protected areas. She voted against the bombing of Syria in 2013, but not because she was against the bombing of Syria, because she actually felt that David Cameron should put boots on the ground, should actually militarily intervene in Syria. Cox's legacy was the sanctioning of further military intervention in Syria under the familiar guise of humanitarian aid, the weaponization of humanitarian aid. Like so many neoliberals, Cox fundamentally argued that the only pathway to peace was the removal of Assad and the victory for the rebels. They gave little or no consideration to the reality that this would inevitably lead to the rise of violent sectarianism under an alleged moderate Islamist governance, which would plunge Syria into the same terrorist vacuum that we've seen in Libya. It's also important here to bring in the role of the media. The media in the UK and in the US have uniformly defended, supported, and promoted the white helmets. They have attacked viciously anyone who dares to question the motives of the white helmets in Syria, and that includes myself and Eva. But what is very interesting, I did an investigation into who was actually behind the production and the promotion of the White Helmet movies, one of which, of course, the Netflix project, won the Oscar in 2017. And the second one, Last Men in Aleppo, was put forward, was nominated for another Oscar, failed to get it. But of course, we also need to remember that the White Helmets have been nominated 3 times for the Nobel Peace Prize. But in this article, I actually go into huge depth on who is behind it. And guess who is behind the promotion, the production, and the promotion of those 2 films? Yep, you got it. The Guardian, the BBC, and Channel 4. Worth reading the article. Now, I come on to the Joe Cox Funds. Very interesting collection of people, and in the center is Brendan Cox, Joe Cox's husband, who, as I say, extraordinary. On the day of her murder, he was capable of setting up the Joe Cox Fund with 4 of probably some of the most influential transformation managers in the world today. I'll probably not go into quite as much detail as I normally would because, as I said, I think we're a little bit pressed on time. But in the top left, you have Mabel Van Orange. Now, she's extremely well known in the smart power complex, as Patrick has already described to you. But more so than for her role at NGOs like Girls Not Brides, etc. But she co-founded the European Council on Foreign Relations, which was a globalist pan-European think tank whose members are a mix of EU politicians and top figures in the European media. But the ECFR is more than just a think tank, given that it's essentially an extension of a powerful and controversial billionaire network headed by George Soros, whose Open Society Foundation was largely responsible for providing the ECFR's initial funding. Orange's connections, Mabel Van Orange's connections, she worked for Soros, she worked within the Open Society Foundation. And at the age of 25, and just out of university, Orange founded the European Action Council for Peace in the Balkans and served as its CEO until 1997, when she left to join Soros's Open Society Foundation. Despite the name appearing to advocate for peace in the Balkans, the group Van Orange founded was instead stocked with powerful US warmongers and warhawks and neocons who advocated for anything but peace. And in fact, this organization effectively enabled the bombing of the Balkans. So almost immediately, before I even start looking at all the others, you have someone who is clearly invested in US, UK, militarism, and adventurism. And unsurprisingly, the European Action Council for Peace in the Balkans issued a call in 1995 under Orange's leadership for an end to the arms embargo against Bosnia, the withdrawal of the UN forces, and the NATO air campaign. Now, where's Nick Grono? Nick Grono, over in that corner. He worked with Joe Cox at the Anti-Slavery Freedom Fund. Now, the NGO complex, I would urge everybody to read and study the work of a very dear colleague of mine, Corey Morningstar, who Eva also knows and works with. But her work is seminal in dissecting the smart power complex, the NGO complex, the instrumentalization of everybody's humanitarian reflexes, of your compassion, the complex that gives you the feeling that you have a stakeholding in the future of humanity. Please read her work. The Freedom Fund was first announced by former US President Bill Clinton at the 2013 annual Clinton Global Initiative meeting in New York. It was founded with $30 million provided by 3 philanthropic foundations of powerful billionaires and financial interests. Humanity United, a foundation funded by Pierre Omidyar and his wife Pamela, the Legatum Foundation, and the Minderoo Foundation, all of which have connections to, for example, Goldman Sachs, to the Rothschilds. So what we're seeing here is the building of a web of oligarchical hierarchy. And this is what is behind, what you see in the white helmets is like a pinprick. What is going on behind and what is radiating out behind is leading you to some of the most powerful globalist elite in the world today. Grono, by the way, also connected with Mabel Van Orange on her NGO, Girls Not Brides. So what you'll also see is the interchangeability between all of these NGOs. I describe it as a hydra. If one head is discredited, it's chopped off and another one grows back in its place. All of these people have worked together for years in different arenas. They've worked together in the Balkans. They've worked together in Libya, in Iraq, in Sudan. They know each other for a very long time. Tim Dixon, down here, was co-founder of Purpose Europe, a branch of the Avaaz-fostered behavioral change experts. And again, I really urge that you look at Cory Morningstar's work, particularly on Avaaz. But the creation, if we come back to Purpose, fundamentally, Purpose created the White Helmets back in 2013 from a marketing and publicity point of view. The connection through to Avaaz means that Avaaz is there to influence public opinion, to push forward behavioral change, transformation in any direction they want it to go through its petitioning and through its influence over its members. Where am I? Down there, Gemma Mortensen. Executive Director of Crisis Action, 2006 to 2009, where she worked with Brendan Cox. 2006 to 2015, she perceived herself as a catalyst for global change. She's worked with Tim Dixon also within Crisis Action, but she's now set up change.org, which you'll all know from online petitions. But what is really interesting, if we come back to Crisis Action, they're basically an impressive cluster of the world's humanitarian organizations or human rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Oxfam, Save the Children, Mercy Corps, International Crisis Group, and many other NGOs that basically work as an extension of Western policy in a chosen conflict zone. In fact, the Crisis Action Network is probably one of the most expansive webs of the smart power complex that I've ever come across. But among the Syria-related NGOs that we find within the Crisis Action Network are Syria Campaign, who again run the marketing for the White Helmets, Avaaz, 38 Degrees, another branch of Avaaz. The UN Foundation, again, has promoted the White Helmets extensively on its platforms. Mosaic Syria, Chatham House, a government-influenced think tank in the UK. Interaction has given peace awards to the White Helmets. But they also include the Muslim Council of Britain, heavily influenced by Islamist organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood. Many of these crisis action partners were listed as supporters of the White Helmets in the run-up to the Nobel Peace Prize in 2016, when they failed in their bid, thank goodness, to win the prize. Although we do have to remember that Barack Obama and Kissinger have been given the prize. Unsurprisingly, Mabel Van Orange is on the board of Crisis Action. Greenpeace is also under the crisis action umbrella. And what was quite extraordinary was in the run-up to the Nobel Peace Prize, Greenpeace were actually promoting the White Helmets to get the Nobel Peace Prize. And when a number of people wrote to Greenpeace and said they were horrified that an organization like Greenpeace was supporting an organization which is effectively enabling war and the destruction of environment in Syria, Greenpeace sent out a standard letter, which I swear to this day was written by Syria Campaign, to all of those people, basically reiterating the fact that the only propaganda, the only ones attacking the White Helmets are the Russians. Most of the attacks against the White Helmets come from Syrians. They come from Syrian civilians. But it just demonstrates to what extent this crisis action network is manufacturing and controlling the narrative, even among the NGO complex. This was just one story that Crisis Action and Change.org collaborated to produce, which was kind of the last doctor in Aleppo story during the liberation of East Aleppo. Hamza al-Khatib, not his real name was Ziad Kataji, who wrote the letter to Obama calling for military intervention based on the fact that he is the last doctor in Aleppo, etc., etc. I probably don't need to tell you the whole story, but what is very interesting is that he was not a doctor. He never actually qualified as a doctor at Aleppo University. Not only that, but private conversations between him and some of the terrorist factions demonstrated the fact that he knew the people in East Aleppo were being starved by the terrorist groups, that he participated in the execution of prisoners, both civilian and soldiers. And this was the doctor that Change.org, Crisis Action, CNN, all of them were promoting as the hero in Aleppo that was saving lives under the bombs of the Syrian government. James Le Mesurier, now, I highlighted there one of the articles where we actually track the blueprint that, in my view, began in former Yugoslavia, in the Balkans, in Kosovo, in 1999, and is now being repeated in Syria. Why is this important? Because this is where the harvesting comes in. James Le Mesurier, this took me quite a long time to actually research, and I finally got a breakthrough last year when I found somebody who had worked in Kosovo at the same time and actually knew who he was, and actually knew that he worked in Pristina under the UN representative, Bernard Kouchner, who was also the founder of Médecins Sans Frontières, before he basically broke away from them in '79 because MSF wanted to distance themselves from a number of more controversial elements of Kouchner's campaigning. But he then created Doctors of the World. So basically, James Le Mesurier, sorry. So when he was in Kosovo working under Bernard Kouchner, he was seconded to the office of the High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina before being sent to Kosovo in summer of '99 after the deployment of the Kosovo forces to the province. From July 1999 to 2000, Le Mesurier was appointed intelligence coordinator for Pristina City, acting as liaison officer between the intel officers of different national contingents in KFOR. Le Mesurier left the British Army in 2000. From January 2001 to 2002, Le Mesurier was deputy head of the Advisory Unit on Security and Justice and the special representative of the Secretary General Hans Herkop's security policy body within the UN mission in Kosovo. In this position, Le Mesurier acted as political advisor to the UN Police Commissioner and represented the SRSG on civil-military police coordination bodies. He led the interdepartmental working groups developing regulatory regimes for private security companies and weapon possession and control. But what is very, very interesting is actually Le Mesurier in my view, was tasked with whitewashing the KLA, which at this point, the Kosovo Liberation Army, which again was supported and financed by the British government, certainly, but obviously also by the US administration. And at this point consisted of Albanian warlords and Al-Qaeda elements. And he was instructed to transform this terrorist organization, effectively, this mercenary terrorist organization, into the Kosovo Protection Corps. So into a security organization, right? I hope you're starting to see the connection here. And at the same time, the KLA was running organ trafficking operations, taking Serbs into Albania, into what were called the yellow houses, where particularly children were having their organs extracted. And there's a very famous video of Bernard Kouchner being questioned over these operations, where he laughs manically when he's asked about the yellow houses. Now, Kouchner, if you look at Kouchner's history, he has a history of enabling organ extraction, pedophilia. It's a documented history from Romania, where he actually released a known pedophile, or he had just been released, and he was sent into Romania to take care of the orphans. When he was accused of pedophilia and child trafficking, Kouchner himself flew in to take him out of Romania. Kouchner was involved in the illegal adoption process from Chad. When children were brought to France under Sarkozy, I think it was called the Noah's Ark, the actual NGO that was running that. Kouchner was involved. So Kouchner has a history, and as I say, it's a documented history of being involved in these activities. So under his administration in Pristina in '99, the KLA were running organ trafficking operations, cross-border organ trafficking operations, and they were being whitewashed by James Le Mesurier, former MI6, who in 2013 set up the White Helmets that are effectively Al-Qaeda dressed in humanitarian clothing. And a recent UN Security Council panel, which I was involved in, I think it was last month, or when was it actually, in December, exposed the White Helmets as being organ traffickers, as being the runners who are taking the bodies from inside Syria to the Turkish border. There are a huge number of documented witness testimonies from East Aleppo, from Eastern Ghouta, from all of the areas that were occupied by the White Helmets and the terrorist groups, from civilians, many of whom their children were lightly injured. They were taken by the White Helmets to the Turkish border. They were brought back dead with the familiar wound from here to here, which we also often see, obviously, in Palestine, and the organs removed. I urge everyone to look at the UN Security Report by, sorry, his name's just escaped me, but I can give everybody details on it afterwards. So what I'm trying to do here is to draw very clear parallels between what happened in Kosovo and what is now being seen to have happened inside Syria. I myself have a huge number of testimonies from civilians in Eastern Ghouta and from civilians in East Aleppo of the fact that the White Helmets were paid to take the bodies from those areas to the Turkish border, where they would be examined for their use for organs. If, for example, they were children, I don't know if you all remember the terrible suicide bombing of the evacuees from Kafraya and Foua, which happened in Rashdin in April 2017. Actually, we all just arrived in Aleppo as it had happened. So we interviewed people the next day. But what happened there were over 50 children were piled, some of them dead, some of them dying, some terribly injured, were piled in the back of trucks by the White Helmets, and they were taken. And at least 40 of those children are still missing. This, I think, is from 2016.
Yes. Farhan, today, Dr. Iskaf, a Syrian doctor working in North Syria, reported a staggering number of 18,000 children whose organs have been harvested mainly in Turkish refugee camps. In Turkish hospitals, when they go for treatment for minor injuries, many of them perished and their organs were totally taken out. What is the Human Rights Council and what other investigations are doing about this? Why should this come from a doctor who works there, not from the United Nations?
Well, first of all, as you know, because of our limited presence on the ground, we don't have any first-hand information about the reports you just cited. We have tried, through the work of the Commission of Inquiry, dealing with human rights and reporting to the Human Rights Council, to get as much information we can through the sources we have at our disposal about violations of human rights in Syria. And so the Commission of Inquiry has produced a number of reports, as you've seen, and the Human Rights Council has evaluated them. It's on the basis of what the Commission of Inquiry can acquire and the information that it's able to verify that the Human Rights Council is trying to act.
Obviously, some of the rebel groups are targeting Armenians in particular. Their churches have been ransacked, totally damaged, and other Armenian families have been.
Extraordinary, the response from the UN. But not very surprising when we remember the fact that in March 2015, I don't know if you all remember Samantha Power having a closed meeting at the UN where they showed a film of an alleged chlorine gas attack in Samin. And they showed images of children that were effectively being abused and exploited to produce the propaganda to support the narrative of a chemical attack. Now, some of you may not have seen that video, but the Swedish Doctors for Human Rights, when I showed it to them, they conducted an investigation. And their view was that the medical procedures being carried out and being filmed by the White Helmets and then being shown at the UN, being used by Samantha Powers to call for further military escalation in Syria, the medical procedures were completely incorrect, and I don't want to misquote the Swedish Doctors for Human Rights, but effectively what they said, at one point one of the children had a needle put into his chest and it was moved around like this, and the doctors who witnessed the video said if the child was not already dead, he would be dead after that injection. So I'm just trying to impress upon you to what extent, we mentioned it in the veto, to what extent children are being exploited to promote war that is going to kill, torture, and maim more children. What I want to leave you with is a video that I picked up. It was actually one of the White Helmet promo videos, but most of their videos do not seem right to me. But this one in particular, I felt that it was worth translating what was being said, or rather what was being screamed in the background, because the whole video just seemed wrong to me. But I don't want to put ideas in your head. I would just like you to watch the video and then let me know what you think.
الله أكبر الله أكبر يفيد لي بكفر سجني الله أكبر غارب الطيران الحربي الله أكبر الله أكبر يا دفاع مدني دفاع مدني بس جريحة 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 الله أكبر الله أكبر 2/2/2018 الله أكبر غارب الطيران الحربي على كفر سجني الله أكبر جريحة جريحة لحقة لحقة الله أكبر الله أكبر حسبي الله ونعم الوكيل حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل حسبنا الله ونعم الوكيل لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله ريف إدلب الجنوبي كفر سجني 8/2/2018 لا دفاع الله أكبر الله أكبر
I asked at one point in Damascus, and I'm going to name her now. Her name is Lise Doucet. Eva already mentioned her. She's one of the most well-known BBC journalists covering Syria. And I had a conversation with her off the record in Damascus, and I asked her why the BBC is not investigating the White Helmets. Her answer to me was that it's too polarizing and it's too controversial. That's a political answer from a journalist. And what I will now challenge Lise Doucet and all of the other journalists in The Guardian, in the CNN, in Al Jazeera, in the BBC, Channel 4, who have supported and promoted this organization. If these accusations are proven to be correct, and if the White Helmets are running organ trafficking operations, if they are running a red market, the harvesting of tissue and blood and organs from the victims of war, then those media outlets are apologists for organ trafficking. And they are apologists for war.